time. We have Jacob, Kaden, and Eli. What books are y'all reading?
I am reading Are You My Mother?
Okay.
I'm gonna pick out a book after we're done with doing story time.
Okay, what about you, Jacob?
Middle School, The Worst Years of My Life. I got it for Christmas.
Yay! Okay.
From
All
my
right.
mom.
Very nice. Okay, so we're going to read Seaman chapter 2 and possibly chapter 3. All right. Okie dokie. So we have not Seaman. All right. So a little bit of an update. I haven't been doing story time for a little while because I was asked to parent coach in summer, and then I was asked to substitute K4, and then I got the coronavirus, and so I was quarantined up in my room, so I wouldn't contaminate the rest of the family. And then after that, I went to Swainsboro Middle School for 4 months to help sub for a teacher that had the coronavirus extremely at extreme levels. Then I thought I had it again, but it ended up probably being the flu because I tested negative for the virus the second time, but my husband tested positive for the flu, so that's what it probably was, and that was in November. So, and then when it comes to the vaccination, I'm choosing not to get vaccinated because they have nanoparticles in the vaccination this year, and I researched some of that, and I don't feel comfortable with that. So I usually don't vaccinate in general, since they have mercury in a lot of the other vaccinations or other preservatives, and some of them are also synthetic. So I haven't vaccinated in quite a while, but that's your choice. And there are waivers that you can sign that you don't have to have the vaccine. So, but that's just my update. And we are back, and we are going to read Seaman, and we are on chapter 2. Here we go. So chapter 2 is on, let's see, that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is on page 7 if you purchase the book and you're following along. And Seaman is what? A historical fiction. And what does a historical fiction mean?
A historical fiction.
It happened in history.
Well, and they do what to it?
They make it look like it becomes.
Well, it did happen in real life, but they add to it, right, Jacob? You're learning that in 7th grade about historical fiction. Yeah, because I was substituting for 4 months for a reading teacher in 7th grade at Jacob's school in Swainsboro Middle School. All right, so chapter 2, Getting Ready, August 31st, 1803 through May 1804. Seaman stood beside Meriwether Lewis aboard the keelboat. It's hard for me to read because there's a light on the film, and so when I look at you, there's bright lights in my face, and then when I look at the words, it's kind of hard to read, so bear with me. All right. Okay. The river was low, and the keelboat large and bulky, so traveling down the Ohio was hard work. The hot sun bare down on the seaman's back. He patted his tongue brimming out of his mouth. Suddenly, Seaman raised his head and sniffed. He trotted past the boat's cabin to front of the keelboat and stared at the water. This is my son Silas. He's friends with the boys.
I'm about to sit on your lap.
This is the book dedicated to him. He recommended me to read this book. Meriwether Lewis followed, curious about what his dog had discovered. Up ahead, the waters surface seemed to be covered with funny gray balls, each moving above its town, small, sleek. Lewis brushed his hair. Thank you for visiting, Silas.
Love you.
Love you too. Did you have a question?
No.
Okay.
I just wanted to be at the location.
Look at that, he said, the men rowing the boat. Why, those are squirrels. Dozens and dozens, hundreds of gray squirrels are swimming across the river. Seaman pranced back and forth eagerly. All right, Seaman, Lewis said, smiling. Get him, Lewis, tapped Seaman's broad back. The dog needed needed no further urging. With a leap, he splashed into the river. The boat's crew laughed at Seaman, hit the water on land. The big Newfoundland. Have you ever seen a Newfoundland dog? They're really big.
No.
Thick black coat looked bulky, but in water he was as sleek and graceful as a seal. His powerful legs stroking Seaman swam into the mass of squirrels and caught one in his jaws. He tossed his head and jerked the squirrel's body into the air, snapping its neck. Ooh. Caden, sit up, please. Then he turned toward the keelboat and swam against the river's current with the limp gray body in his mouth.
So is it like a dog like Scooby-Doo?
No, it's a bigger dog. It's a real dog. And he got a bunch of squirrels in the water.
Honestly.
Right here.
Oh my gosh.
Then he turned toward the keelboat and swam against the river's current with the limp gray body in his mouth. When he reached the boat, he raised his chin and patted in place while Lewis leaned over the side and took the squirrel. Instantly, Seaman turned and swam back towards the squirrels. So he's getting squirrels out of the water to feed the men. So the men are going to eat squirrels. Have you ever ate squirrel?
No.
Yes. You have eaten squirrel?
No.
What did it taste like?
Yummy.
Yummy? He repeated the performance again and again, and heaped up damp squirrels soon filled the prow of keelboat. That's a fine dog, called John Coulter, a lean, muscular member of the crew. He looked at Lewis and a grin on his stunned face. Have you ever tasted squirrel meat, Captain? Lewis shook his head. Makes mighty good eating. Coulter said, back in Kentucky, we used to hunt squirrel. The meat's lean and tasty, makes my mouth water just thinking about the smell of squirrel meat and frying in the pan. Now, gentlemen, there's only certain months you can kill squirrel because the other months they have parasites and you don't want to eat worms, right?
Yeah.
Right. The men pulled on their oars eagerly, thinking of the evening supper. At this time out here, Lewis shook his head and he gazed out over the broad expanse of water. I've never even heard of squirrels migrating across the river. Seaman swam back to the boat and Lewis knelt down to take a squirrel from his mouth. Before the dog turned to continue hunting, Lewis said, "That's enough, Seaman." He reached out to pull the dog onto the boat. Coulter ran over to help. The big dog scrambled abroad and shook his long coat. Water sprayed everywhere, and the men ducked. Grinning, Coulter brushed off his face and sleeves. Seaman's a great hunting dog. Does your guys' grandpa have a hunting dog?
No.
Captain, eager to please, happy to work.
Oh, Miss Rose. We do have two German Shepherds.
Okay, what color are they?
One's brown, like it looks like chocolate.
Huh.
It looks like a Reese's cup, and we have one named Snow.
Snow, and that one's white.
Yep.
What's the brown one called?
Her name's Nellie, but she looks like a Reese's Pieces.
Okay. Lewis agreed. Seaman's willingness to hunt was one more proof he was the right dog for the coming journey. That evening in camp, Seaman lay beside Lewis, facing a blazing fire. Get up here, brother, please. Thank you. Lewis bit into a piece of fried squirrel meat, and the men watched him. It's delicious. he declared. The men whooped and dug in. Lewis fed a piece to Seaman, who swallowed the morsel in a big gulp. Another man laughed and held out a piece from his plate. Seaman hesitated. What does hesitated mean?
Suffocating or something.
No. What does hesitated mean, Jacob?
Had an epiphany.
No, hesitated means like you kind of stop. Like you're not too sure. Like remember when I gave you guys that cheese today, Caden? Sit up, please.
Yes, ma'am.
Caden, sit up, please. Remember I gave you that cheese that you guys never tasted before?
Yeah.
And you might have hesitated before you tasted it because you weren't sure what it's going to taste like?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
That's weird.
That cheese yummy.
Where did I leave off? Okay, looking at Lewis, the dog's furry ears were cocked and skinny strings of drool hung from his lips. What's drool?
Drool?
Is it like spit?
It's like
saliva.
It's like spit that comes
saliva.
down your mouth.
That's right. Lewis nodded instantly. Seaman scrambled to his feet. He wiggled his way around the fire, collecting hunks of meat and pats from the men. So what were the men doing?
Clicking your feet.
No, he was getting the meat, but they were patting him. What does that mean? Can you pat your head for me? There we go. When Seaman reached John Coulter, he gobbled up the meat, then licked Coulter's ear. "That's all right, fellow," Coulter said, laughing. "No need to thank me. You earned this squirrel meat." Lewis watched his men play with the dog. Lewis had commanded soldiers, and he knew that a dog reminds men of home, of campfires shared with fathers, brothers, and childhood friends. Seaman could take a chill out of the black nights better than a fire. Lewis watched as his men grinned and patted the big dog. He smiled as Seaman licked their faces and nuzzled their hands. It was only September, and the Ohio River was carrying Lewis and his men in the frontier, the edge of the white settlements. Have you guys ever been to Ohio?
Nope.
No, not at all.
Okay, where you're taught? You never been to Ohio?
We've been to St. Augustine.
No, I don't.
We've been
Your
to
Facebook pull it?
I'm filming right now on Storytime. The frontier, the edge of the white settlement. This trip down the Ohio River was really a preparation, a time to hire the men, pack supplies, and make plans. The expedition to the west would begin following spring in 1804. First, the group would spend the winter in training near St. Louis, the farthest major settlement in the western United States. After St. Louis, there were a few small settlements, some trading posts and wilderness that stretched farther than any United States citizen had traveled, farther than most Americans could imagine. Lewis knew that blacker, chillier nights would come. As explorers, they were going to face unknown dangers. The expedition would take a year or two to reach the Pacific Ocean and return. When the men felt scared or homesick, the dog would help lift their spirits. Have you all ever felt homesick?
Yes.
You have?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, that's neat.
One day I was in the house
Mm-hmm.
7 days. I was in the house a whole week. And then a whole week and then a half week.
I was in the house for about 4 days.
No, homesick isn't when you're in the house. Homesick is when you're away from home and you miss home.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, I haven't.
Along the banks of Ohio, the countryside was mostly forest. Trees lined the riverbanks, their leaves still green and lush. Days fell into a routine. The men awoke with the sun and ate a breakfast of leftovers from yesterday's supper. They broke camp, pushed off the boats, and proceeded on their journey. The group rowed downstream each day, struggling to move the heavy wooden keelboat through the shallow waters. Sometimes it snagged, and the men had to lift or drag it into deeper water. Have y'all ever seen these story times in your class? There's there's a lot of different classes in different schools that watch these story times.
They
Have
won't
you?
stop leaning on me.
Oh, I know Miss Karen Moxley's and Miss Jenna Mobley. Sometimes they tune in and they watch these in their classrooms at school. Yeah.
Jacob won't stop
Okay,
leaning on
river
me.
travel on the keelboat was hard work, but it was necessary because the big vessel could be packed with several tons of supplies. The keelboat had a cabin on its first bottom, so supplies that had so dry could be stored inside. So maybe when you guys are in 6th and 7th grade, you guys will watch this and see how you guys look today when you were little. In addition, the keelboat, the group had smaller boats that were easier to handle. 2 canoes and a prog. I wonder what a prog is. A prog looked like a big canoe, except it had a mast, so it could be sailed as well as rowed. So that's a prog. Prog, rowed, like when you row in a boat, like when we row the kayak?
Oh, I thought you said road.
No, rowed. On September 13th, Seaman was riding up front on the bow of the keelboat. He sat with his face catching the breeze, his tongue sticking out a little, like a pink half moon, and the black background of his fur. Suddenly, Seaman raised his head to study a dark, odd-looking cloud in the distant sky. Sniffing, he stood and began to bark. In a matter of minutes, the sun was completely hidden, turning morning into dusk.
Can you please get them to stop leaning?
Y'all need to scoot over, please. Thank you. Turning morning into dusk, but the cloud did not bring rain. It was a cloud of birds. Passenger pigeons were flying overhead in a thick flock. Lewis shook his head at the wonder of it. So many migrating birds, he thought. What animals we see out west? The skies darkened again on September 15th, this time with rain. It rained for 8 long hours, soaking Seaman, Lewis, and the men. The smell of wet wood mingled with the smell of wet buckskin clothing. When the rain stopped, another smell appeared, mildew. Lewis clarked a few of supply boxes and found their contents had gotten damp. What was worse, some of the guns were wet and were starting to rust. Lewis groaned. With rusty guns, the men would not be able to hunt. They had to keep the guns in working order. When the boats passed the sunny sandbar, 2 days later, Lewis ordered the men to pull up. This will be a good place to spread on the supplies. He said the men unpacked clothes and blankets and laid them out to dry in the sun. They took apart the guns, wiped them dry, and oiled them to stop the rusting. Seaman stretched out on the sand and watched the men work. Soon he began to pant in the hot sun. He waited. Gentlemen, please listen. He waded into the river and swam up and down the sandbar. Can your guys' dogs swim in the water?
Yeah.
Yes?
Ours can swim from the whole side of the pond, from the whole other part, into the whole wet.
Oh, that's nice. When the dog hopped out and shook himself, water sprayed on the open boxes of supplies. None of the men scolded Seaman, though his playful spirit made everybody chuckle. For the rest of the day, Seaman took turns swimming and lying on the sandbar. He fished for rocks under the shallow water, scooped them up with his mouth, and then made a pile of them on the shore. Hey, he was collecting rocks. John Coulter picked up a stick and tossed it into the river. Seaman leaped into the water after the stick and promptly brought it back in his mouth. Coulter grinned and rubbed Seaman's wet rump. It took 2 more weeks of river travel to reach Cincinnati. There, Lewis told the men to make camp. He had ordered more supplies to be delivered to them at this town, and the men loaded the boat. Seaman romped with the men and a dozen beside Lewis as he wrote letters. After a few days, then, we're back on the river, heading southwest. The men set up camp again in Clarksville, where William Clark was living at his brother's home. The plan was for Lewis to go ashore and join Clark, who would be... Yes, it is Lewis and Clark.
Wait, so this story's about Lewis and Clark?
Yes.
I did not know
Yes.
that.
Who would be his co-captain in the upcoming expedition. William Clark had run running down the steps, red hair blazing in the sunshine, as he shook hands with Lewis. Excuse me?
I didn't know the story was about Lewis and Clark.
It is about Lewis and Clark. Have you learned about them in school?
Mm-hmm.
Please don't make other noise so the boys and girls can't hear the story, okay? Thank you. His eyes danced with excitement. Seaman watched Lewis's face open into a smile. He saw him grab hold of Clark's hand and shake it warmly. He understood at once that Clark was important, a man to trust and obey. Both Lewis and Clark were tall, about 6 feet, and athletic, both moving at big, determined strides. They were men in a hurry to get things done, confident men. They climbed the steps and sat on the porch, talking in lively, excited voices. Clark's brother joined them, and the three ate and drank, laughing and telling stories. Seaman lay down patiently at the base of the steps when the rich smell of cooking meat drifted to him from around the corner of the house. The dog glanced up at Lewis to make sure he was still talking. Then he got up and went to look for the source of that wonderful smell. The door to the kitchen was closed, so Seaman wandered around the yard. He could hear the men on the porch. Seaman set out to explore the nearby outbuildings. At one of the barns, Seaman saw a tall black man at work on some leather straps. The man whistled, and Seaman approached slowly, holding out his muscular hands. The man let Seaman sniff his fingers. They smelled like leather and oil, with a fainter odor of horse fur and hay. "Hello, big fellow," the man said softly. At the sound of the man's voice, Seaman took a step back. The black man chuckled. "Now, don't you act scared of York. Look at the size of those jaws you have. I should be the one who's scared to go near you." Seaman nuzzled the man's hands. The man stroked Seaman's fur, looked into his deep brown eyes. "I bet you'd like to play, wouldn't you, fellow?" York jogged into the yard, snatched a stick, and tossed it. The Seaman raced after it and brought it back to York. He sat with the stick in his mouth until York took it.
I'm going to the bathroom.
"Well, you sure know your manners, don't you, fellow?" York grinned. He tossed the stick a few more times, then he walked back to the barn to finish his work. Seaman followed. While York cleaned and hung up the leather straps, Seaman explored the barn and sniffed the wooden stalls. A cat hissed "Sss" at him and scrambled up a pile of hay. Seaman barked, "Woof!" York chuckled. He rubbed his hands together and wiped them on his pants. As he left the barn, he whistled. Can you whistle for me, Eli? Thank you. "Come on, big fellow." York walked towards the house, and Seaman bounded alongside his new friend. "Ah, here's York," said Clark when he saw the black man walking through the yard. He waved, and York hopped nimbly up the porch steps. "Merriweather, do you remember my servant?" "Yes, I remember York," said Lewis, smiling and clapping his hand on York's shoulder. "He's been with you since you were a boy, hasn't he? If my memory serves me, he was a gift from your father, and York's father was a lifelong companion and servant to your father." Clark nodded. You have an excellent memory. Lewis took a long, careful look at York. Although the fellow was tall and muscular, he was as light on his feet as a cat. Lewis said, I'm delighted to see you are enjoying good health. York, Mr. Clark says you're eager to see the West. Yes, sir, said the black man. Master William, he likes to see the world, and York goes wherever Master William goes. York gestured at Seaman. This here dog was wandering around the barns. I haven't seen him before, but he's sure a fine animal. He belonged to you, Mr. Lewis? Lewis beamed. This is Seaman, the Newfoundland I purchased in Pittsburgh. Lewis turned to Clark as he spoke. I've been well pleased with him although he's a young animal. He retrieves game expertly. He's a wonderful swimmer, and he's also quite a hunter. Why, he caught a pile of squirrels for our dinner a few weeks ago, caught them in the water, snapped their necks, and swam right back to the boat with them. We had quite a feast, thanks to Seaman. Clark squatted, cupping Seaman's face in his large hand. There is no finer breed for water travel than a Newfoundland. That's a fact, he said, looking closely at the big black dog. Clark ran his hands over Seaman's square head and broad back. He felt the dog's muscular legs and thick fur. His smile showed his approval. He's a sound, healthy creature, Merriweather, steady and good-natured. I think he's just the dog for our journey. Seaman wagged his tail, and Clark smoothed the fluffy fur around the dog's ears. He's a big fellow, though. I'll wager the weighs as much as a man. It's a good thing he knows how to hunt for some of his own groceries. Lewis and Clark spent the next 2 weeks in Clarksville hiring more men. Word had spread out the expedition had many young men were eager to sign on for the adventure. The captains chose hardy fellows who seemed willing to work rather than sons of wealthy families. They chose young men who were used to living outdoors, who seemed cheerful and easy to get along with. Finally, a group was chosen, and the boats were loaded. On October 26th, the men pushed off. They headed downstream with the Ohio River current. The weather was fine. On November 11th, they reached Fort Massac, where they hired a woodsman who knew some Indian languages. They proceeded on. 3 days later, the group met up at the mouth of the Ohio River at the place where it flows into the Mississippi and stayed there a week. Lewis wasn't feeling well. He had chills and fever, and Seaman stayed close to him as he rested in camp. But when the hunting parties went out to bring back game, John Coulter asked permission to take Seaman. Lewis agreed. Yes, by all means, he told Coulter. Seaman can use the exercise, and he's awfully good at retrieving game. Lewis stroked the dog's fur. Go ahead, Seaman. Seaman stood up, but he hesitated, looking at Lewis. Go, Seaman, Lewis said, and he pointed at Coulter. Go with Coulter. Seaman wagged his tail and ran off beside Coulter. As soon as he was feeling better, Lewis began teaching Clark to pinpoint their location by measuring latitude and longitude. The angle of the sun's shadow had to be recorded at midday, and at night the position of the moon and stars was measured. The readings could only be taken in clear weather. Although making these measurements was difficult, time-consuming, it was important because the expedition would be going into lands that had never been mapped. As explorers traveled westward, the captains would take measurements every day or two. When the expedition returned, map makers would be able to draw maps on the Northwest using this information and the captain's written reports. The captain took the night measurements after their men had gone to sleep. They used a special instrument recording every few minutes for an hour or so. Lewis taught Clark how to identify the stars and read the instrument. Together, the pair practiced one calling out numbers for the other to record. Do you guys know how to recognize some of the stars, like the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper and all of that? Yeah. During these evenings practice sessions, Seaman lay beside Lewis and watched the captain's faces. These men were delighted by by each other's company. They were so eager to begin their adventure that excitement could be read in the tone of their voices, the set of their jaws, and the spring of their steps. Their mood was contagious. Everybody in the camp felt it, even calm-natured Seaman. On the afternoon of November 16th, Lewis left one of the men in charge of the camp and whistled to Seaman. Thank you. The dog hopped into the prog. Was it prog again?
A big canoe that had a sail on it.
There you go. Very good. Clark pushed off, and the two captains rowed to the western side of the Mississippi River to record the river's width. They pulled the boat onto the bank and hiked through the woods. When they approached a nearby Indian camp, some of the natives strolled over to chat. Seaman sat patiently at Lewis's side, and as they talked. One of the Indians held out his hand for Seaman to smell. The dog did not growl, and the Indian patted Seaman. He nodded at Lewis and said, "Big dog." Lewis smiled. He was proud of Seaman, so he wanted to show off. "Watch," he said, and he tossed the stick for Seaman to retrieve. The dog fetched the stick and sat at Lewis's feet. Lewis took the stick and showed it to the Indian. "No teeth marks," he said, displaying the smooth bark. The Indian nodded again. He pointed to a pile of pelts. "There," he said, 3 skins. Good dog. We trade. All beaver skins very warm and 3 for 1 dog." The smile faded from Lewis's face, and he turned quite pale. "No trade," he said. "I bought this dog for our expedition. He's worth a lot more than 3 beaver skins." The Indian looked at the pile of pelts as if considering how many he should offer. "No trade," Lewis repeated. He turned to Clark. "Let's go." As the men strode away from the Indian camp, Lewis spoke in an edgy voice. 3 beaver skins? Did this fellow really think I would trade 3 beaver skins for my dog? Why, I paid $20 for Seaman in Pittsburgh. A man doesn't choose just any dog to take along on a voyage to the Pacific Ocean. Look at Seaman. He's a magnificent animal, as big as a calf and as docile as a kitten. Strong, too. His powerful legs, he swims like an otter. "Meriwether, please," laughed Clark. "The man thought he was making you a generous offer. In his village, 3 beaver skins is probably a pricey payment for any dog." "Seaman is not just any dog," Lewis continued, his word tumbling out. "Did you see the way he handled himself in that village? Not so much as one growl. He never left my side, sat right down, as patient as a grandmother. Didn't bother the food cooking over the fires. Why, he even ignored the village dogs." Clark threw his big arm around his partner's shoulder. "Meriwether Lewis, I declare, you would trade me before you'd part with that dog." Lewis laughed, his face turning pink. "Well, I prize the animal for his qualifications for our journey." "Of course you do, man," Clark said, chuckling. "And, well, you should, but the Indian offer was not an insult. In his way, he was complimenting your choice of a dog." On November 20th, the men loaded the boats to continue their journey. They pushed into Mississippi River and turned the boats upstream, heading towards the mouth of the Missouri River. After making camp for the winter, they would be traveling upstream on the Missouri for most of their trip west. As soon as the boats turned upstream, the captains knew they underestimated their task. What does that mean, underestimated? They thought it was going to be one way, and they realized it's another way. The boats were heavily loaded with supplies, and the river's current was swift. Although the men were strong and hardy, they were straining against their oars. Going against the current was so difficult that they had to take a zigzag course. What does zigzag mean?
Like,
Yep, that's right.
like drawing in zigzags.
They rowed the boats across the river, heading slightly upstream to each crossing. But this method was terribly slow. The boats only traveled about 1 mile upstream in each hour. It was not long before Lewis turned to Clark and spoke in a grim voice. "We are going to need more muscle on our expedition. We need more men." Clark nodded. He had come to the same conclusion. "I know, but more men means we'll need more supplies." "Yes, and more supplies means we'll need more boats and more hunters to supply us with more game." Lewis frowned. Clark watched Lewis's face. "It's a good thing we discovered this now, Meriwether," he said calmly. Lewis nodded. He shook off his dark mood, and all he thought was with a rush. They were about to begin a great adventure in the history of the United States. They agreed then, Lewis said, clapping his hand on Clark's shoulder. "We'll take on more men at the army post in Cascada." The expedition reached Cascada on November 28th. More men were recruited, more supplies were loaded. A spot was chosen for the winter camp at the mouth of the Missouri River. By mid-December, the men were building Camp Wood. At first, the winter camp bustled with activity. The men were busy sawing, hammering, and moving supplies. As soon as the camp wood was complete, the men settled into a routine. Lewis made trips to St. Louis to purchase more supplies, mail letters, and make arrangements. He and Clark talked with traders and trappers who had been up the Missouri River. The captain sketched informational maps of their intended route based on these conversations. Seaman went on hunting trips with John Coulter. He ran beside the men on their training drills. Whenever York had time, he threw sticks into the river for Seaman to retrieve. One of the younger men, George Shannon, wrestled playfully with him. By middle of March, the Missouri River was free of ice. The days grew warmer and the men grew restless to begin their adventure. On the morning of March 31st, Lewis and Clark sat together looking over a list of names. Seaman dozed beside Lewis as the captains talked. When they got up and strode into the open area in the center of Camp Wood, Seaman trotted along next to the men. The captains ordered the men to assemble. Seaman watched as the captains announced the names of the men chosen to come on the expedition to the Pacific Ocean. Each man stepped forward as the captains called his name. These men would be the main party of explorers for the Corps of Discovery. 26 men were chosen to be the Corps of Discovery. 3 sergeants were announced: Charles Ford, Nathan Pryor, and John Outway. 9 of the men from Kentucky, including John Coulter and young George Shannon. 2 of the chosen men were brothers. 2 were cousins, and some were friends. A few of the men had been raised by Indian mothers and could speak a few words of tribal languages. Some of the men had traded with the Indians and knew the sign language used by the tribes that lived along the Missouri River. The group included men who were expert hunters, fishermen, and trappers. There were men who could run a blacksmith's forge, build with wood, steer a boat, and play a fiddle. Almost all the men were in their late 20s or early 30s and unmarried, like their captains. The captains told the rest of the men, a smaller group of about 20, that they would go along for the first part of the journey. The smaller group would return with the scientific notes and samples of plants and animals that were collected during the first leg of the journey. As soon as the announcements were finished, the men chose to be in the Corps of Discovery whooped with joy. They shook each other's hands and slapped backs all around. George Shannon raced over to Seaman and threw his arms around the big dog's neck. At 18, Shannon was the youngest man to be chosen. Seaman licked Shannon's cheeks, his tail waving back and forth. Although York's name was not read aloud, Clark put his hand on the black man's shoulder and said he would be part of the Corps of Discovery. York broke into a little jig, and John Coulter grinned and clapped his hands. Barking happily, Seaman romped around the group. Lewis and Clark watched with the merriment, beaming like proud fathers. Soon the Lewis and Clark expedition would begin. That's the end of chapter 2. I hope you're enjoying the story and following along. Please remember to read 30 minutes every day because that improves your reading. 20 minutes, it stays the same. Less than 20, it depreciates. I hope you're having fun and you had a wonderful, happy 2/21. Woo! Thank
Happy
you for
New Year.
Yes, Happy New Year. All right.
Adios.